any case in one of my responses to your earlier questions. So something will be covered on that.
Fantastic. Great. Richard, any last notes from you?
Unmute. Just to say that the music is winding up. It'll be over probably within the minute, and maybe that will be our cue to begin. I see participants coming in. They just promoted all the sessions, so hopefully throughout our session, our numbers will go up, up, up. And Mahira, are you admin 5, UN 75? Please, oh, wonderful.
Yes, I am. That is me.
Yeah, and am I correct that nobody is hearing us? The participants do not hear us yet. You have to hit.
We started broadcasting at 10:27.
Oh.
As per the instructions. So let's go ahead and move into the webinar and let's get started.
All right, then we are now live, and but at the same time, let us briefly welcome Ambassador Skoog. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center. We're absolutely delighted to have everybody here for this very important session on human rights and humanitarian action, linked to the UN 75th anniversary themes, issues at the heart of the declaration that will be endorsed by world leaders. And in a minute, or a few seconds actually, I'll turn things over to our amazing moderator, Natalie Samarasinghe. But just want to note that don't miss the sessions that begin immediately after this session that will take place over the next 90 minutes. And consult your agenda for the next 2.5 days of activities ahead. We welcome you once again. Natalie.
Thanks so much, Richard, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you're joining from. My name is Natalie Samarasinghe. I'm delighted to be moderating this session on reimagining the global human rights and humanitarian architecture. I understand that you were able to hear everything we said before, so we probably could skip this session as we've revealed what we're going to be doing already. But in all seriousness, I'm really pleased to be here. For the past year or so, I've been working as Chief of Strategy for the UN 75th Anniversary Initiative. And I think, you know, even before the advent of COVID-19, humanity was facing this huge raft of challenges from the existential risks posed by climate change and nuclear weapons, to deepening inequalities, rising geopolitical tensions, corrosive nationalism, and popular discontent. And against that backdrop, the Secretary General really did not envisage UN 75 as a big birthday party, but rather as a moment of reflection, of listening to the people we serve, to better understand their hopes and fears for the future, and to capture their ideas on how to solve the challenges we face. So we launched a global conversation to crowdsource priorities and solutions for the future. About 1 million people in all countries have taken our UN 75 survey to date, providing unique insights into what the world wants at this challenging time. But the real substance has come from events like this one. The Stimson Center and its partners, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the Global Challenges Foundation, One Earth Future Foundation, you have all made an outstanding contribution to our consultation, and we're really grateful to you and can't wait to hear the ideas emerging from this forum, including, of course, this session on human rights and humanitarian action. I will share with you one of the most fascinating things to emerge from our consultation. I did not expect this at all. But human rights and humanitarian action were the two areas where the general public felt the UN is having the most impact, with 78% and 79% respectively saying the UN is succeeding a lot, or at least somewhat in these areas. The numbers were quite substantially lower for other parts of the UN's work. On the humanitarian front, I can understand it. It's one of the most visible activities of the UN. The UN is often the first to respond on the ground, the last to leave, long after the headlines have faded away. It often goes where others can't or won't go. But its humanitarian response can be fragmented, split across political decision-making in the Security Council, political work in the Secretariat, and then the frontline efforts of the agencies on the ground. Human rights, meanwhile, it surprised me because I think it remains probably the most contentious area of the UN's work in many ways. It forces the UN to grapple with fundamental questions of legitimacy, universality, and sovereignty. At the same time, it's produced some of the UN's most transformative successes. at the normative level and on the ground, from the creation of the human rights, laws and norms that we have, to giving voice to civil society movements and furthering self-determination, the end of apartheid and democracy. But I think in both areas, the UN has been criticized for acting too slowly or timidly, for responding in a disjointed fashion. It is sometimes accused of being a helpless bystander, or even worse, complicit in abuses. The 75th anniversary gives us an opportunity to engage with these issues and to reimagine the human rights and humanitarian systems. Not just because that's a nice thing to do when you have an anniversary, but because this work is more urgent than ever. COVID-19 continues to cause suffering around the world. It has already had a devastating impact on human development, with the first increase in global poverty in over 2 decades. It's likely to exacerbate humanitarian needs. And on the human rights side, we've already seen pandemic restrictions used, for example, to shut down civil society space. The UN 75 Global Consultation found a powerful desire for change, with people calling for more effective global decision-making and more inclusive processes. We have an absolutely stellar panel to discuss these issues. We have Advocate Hina Jalani, who's president of the World Organization Against Torture, as well as a member of the Elders. We have Ambassador Olof Skoog, the head of the delegation of the European Union to the UN. Welcome. We have Cindy Huang, the Vice President of Strategic Outreach at Refugees International. And we have Michael Liu, the founder and director of the Chinese Initiative on International Law. So I'm going to start by putting a few questions to them, looking first at the political declaration that will be adopted by the General Assembly next Monday for the 75th anniversary. Then I'm going to delve a little bit more into priorities in light of COVID, some ideas for change. And then we'll have questions from you. So please start putting them to the panelists using the Q&A function. Let me turn first to you, Advocate Jalani. The UN 75 declaration mentions human rights 9 times. That's not bad for a 4-page document. The whole UN Charter only mentions it seven times. In the declaration, member states speak about rights in relation to recovering from the pandemic, to the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality, digital cooperation, and building trust. Having served as the UN Special Representative on Human Rights Defenders, what would you say is the UN's #1 strength in this area? And where do you think it falls short of expectations?
Thank you very much, Natalie. I think just before we started, you did mention that I have said many times before that the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis involved is not just a health crisis, but it has revealed to us how much of a human rights crisis this is and can be, and can still be. So I do believe that the UN has a role, but the UN's role is very much similar to the role that governments play in ensuring that while they deal with a civil emergency like the pandemic that we are facing right now, they also pay attention to their obligations to respect human rights and the rule of law. I think I have been kind of woken up by this emergency. I don't see it as a one-time thing related to COVID alone. I think this has given us many insights into how we react to save populations on the one hand, in terms of their right to life and their right to health, but also to make sure that while we are doing it, we are making very sure that human rights, rule of law, democracy are receiving our attention at the same time. I have experienced, especially not just in my own country, but the whole region that I live in, that this in some ways gave the governments an impression that everything else can be brushed aside and measures can be taken in the name of preventing the spread of disease or saving people's lives, and measures that certainly offended human rights sensitivities as well as created actual violations were taken. So I do believe that for instance, I think one of the things that has come very much visible to me is that in countries where there is an absence of adequate social security measures, it becomes extremely difficult for people to not just save their own lives, but also it becomes a matter of livelihoods. It becomes a matter of how people can survive during lockdowns, which though necessary, obviously, for a particular time, they do pose a lot of challenges. For instance, on freedom of movement, on the ability of people to carry on their usual activities and to earn enough to survive. But I think also what we have seen, and I really appreciate that, there has been a response from the UN on this. And I greatly appreciate the Secretary General's call for human rights to be at the center of the COVID-19 response. Now, how much attention is paid to that call is another question. But I do believe that the level of attention paid has a very close nexus to the waning importance and significance and respect for multilateralism in this in the global environment today. So I think there a lot of work may have to be done to make sure that the support for the UN, the support for multilateral efforts and multilateral consultations before measures are put in place at the global level have to be respected, and we have to go for that. I think also it is important for us to remember that during this crisis and in other civil and other conflict-related situations, we have seen that the civil society has been an active partner in giving relief, in giving support to victims, in making sure that governments are able to fulfill their obligation, not just to protect, but also to put forward the measures for making sure that people can survive that particular period of time. But they don't get, the civil society doesn't get the kind of acknowledgement that it should get of its contribution. And there is very little support for the civil society. Whatever they do because of the energy they have and the commitment they have, rather than the sufficiency of resources. So I do believe that they do need to be supported, but more than supported, whatever they do with their meager resources has to be recognized fully, because they are equal partners with states and with multilateral organizations in giving relief to people during civil emergencies.
Thank you very much. I might turn to you, Ambassador, if I may, and pick up on some of the things that Advocate Jelani raised. I mean, she mentioned, you know, the crisis being exploited, you know, in some instances to suppress human rights, the shrinking of civil society space. But I wanted to really put that to you through the prism again of the UN 75 declaration. The EU was a very strong proponent of the many references to human rights. Why was that so important to you? Was it the context that Advocate Jelani mentioned?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Natalie, and the Stimson Center for organizing this and the work you do to ensure that, you know, the voices of the people are heard, as we, those of us who represent countries here in the UN are aware of that, you know, because without that voice, this whole exercise, I think, of, you know, UN at 75 and whatever else we do here would be quite meaningless and pointless. So thank you very much for that. And I look forward to hearing, you know, the thoughts that may come through during this debate. You know, the human rights, well, there are specific reasons why the EU are so vocal on this, and that has to do with our own, I think, background. But I also think, you know, in these uncertain times, it's very important for us to sort of hold on to the norms that do exist. And, you know, for me, this is the UN Charter, and it fits in your pocket, and it's actually a very inspirational text. And, you know, you don't have to browse through that every day to do the work here. But I very often come back to the preamble, because it states, you know, the first words of this UN Charter is "we the peoples," right? So it's really, first of all, a reflection that it's not it's true that the UN is made up of governments, but governments have to represent the peoples. Otherwise, we've lost that course. And then, you know, the text goes on to say that to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, a fundamental principle of the United Nations. So, you know, people or countries or leaders who question whether the human rights agenda is on equal footing with, you know, peace and security, development, well, you know, I would just have them read page 1 of the UN Charter, where to me it's quite clear that, you know, those are the norms. They are equally important. And from that, I think we've also developed this, you know, it might sound as a slogan, but I think it's based on an understanding of how things work and are sort of connected. There is no peace without development. There's no development without peace, and there can be neither without respect for human rights. And that is, you know, it's something that we insist on as the European Union and the member states, because I think we've also come out of, it isn't that, you know, long ago, Europe was in shatters after the Second World War, and the EU grew out of that, a sense of cooperation and collaboration and, you know, coming together and avoiding the mistrust and you know, that may lead to war, but it's very much based on democracies coming together, respecting, you know, the votes, the elections, and everything, free media, and everything that comes out of a democracy. And so, you know, when we hammer on about these things, it's because we really believe that they are essential in terms of, you know, the UN playing its role, us playing our role in representing our countries, and that is the best model to create the stability and the faith, you know, and representing our people. And the final point maybe on that is that, you know, some would then say, well, yes, but, you know, it isn't just about political rights, it's also about social and development rights. Well, you know, I have no problem with that. I just think that one doesn't exclude the other. Actually, they are mutually reinforcing. And, you know, I think sometimes we have been hammering on about the political rights, but I do not think we, the European Union and the Europe, have anything to be ashamed of in terms of also being proud of what we're trying to do at home and on the global arena, protecting also the social economic rights. And all of those rights, political, social, and economic, as Hina Gilani said, have come to the fore in the shadow of this terrible pandemic. The social economic downturn and the effects of this are devastating around the world. We need to step up, you know, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, help countries come out of their debt situations, etc. Make sure that our development aid is sort of COVID proof, if you see what I mean, and is stepped up, and that there's more financing coming in also from other players. But we also need to make sure that leaders around the world do not take COVID as a pretext for cutting down on you know, the political freedoms that are part of this agenda. And we see that happening. And so, you know, it's all the more urgent. And I'm glad you had counted how many mentionings there were in the Declaration of Human Rights. So I guess that is also a reflection of us having been successful in the diplomatic mission here to get, you know, the prominence of the human rights agenda in its entirety reflected in the work going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I mean, one of the interesting things to come out of our consultation is that fusion and connection between political and economic social rights. When people have spoken about, you know, education, healthcare, sanitation, but through the prism of inequalities and access. So I think that's a really important point to make. I want to come back to something you said, but I'll do so later because I want to bring in Cindy and Michael first. Cindy, so human rights, you know, is there in the declaration. humanitarian action, there's rather less on that. I think the declaration speaks about, you know, assistance being granted without obstacle or delay in line with humanitarian principles. Some in civil society feel that that wasn't sufficient, perhaps doesn't say anything new. What's your take? Does it go to the heart of the issues that you're seeing today?
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I also want to extend my gratitude to you, the Stimson Center, Richard Ponzio, and so many others who've taken time, as Ambassador Skoog said, to listen to the people in this exercise. You know, I wouldn't be the first to note that in recent years, and other panelists have already mentioned this, that the political landscape has become quite tough, including for humanitarian ideals and actors. And that includes many countries who were leaders in creating the UN system, in, you know, writing the charter, turning their back on some of the critical norms, including in the humanitarian space. And as Advocate Jelani rightly mentioned, civil society actors are at the forefront of delivering assistance, and the space that they have to operate is decreasing. So, you know, in this context, I think we would hope for stronger and more specific language on humanitarian access. That being said, I do want to speak about a couple of the strengths as well of the UN system and the agencies. And in some ways, their ability to act and coordinate and lead is even more essential when we see some of the disagreements between member states and amidst the Security Council coming to the fore. So some of those strengths, I know we'll talk about more about COVID in a moment, but I think some of the collective action that the UN system has been able to show around the UN COVID supply chain task force has been essential to meeting humanitarian needs, and WFP and WHO's leadership has been very strong on increasing access to critical diagnostics and personal protective equipment. And that really shows in my mind some of the comparative advantage of that expertise, the logistical systems, and the scale that actually no single member state or NGO could achieve. I wanted to talk about one more example before coming back to where I think improvements are quite necessary. That is around, and Natalie, you mentioned this in your opening, the rapid response and standard setting, and really the technical excellence that the humanitarian agencies have shown. That doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement. Of course there is, but in my personal experience, I know that I, like many others, really watched in horror after you know, the hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing Myanmar for Bangladesh, and just wondering, you know, how could, you know, even the basic necessities be provided for? Again, recognizing that so much more progress needs to be made. The worst predictions about the, you know, the number of fatalities and the lack of services were not met. And that was because there was a coordinated response and the ability of the system, you know, led by UN agencies to meet those needs. So I just want to close by coming back to where we hope more can be done and where more must be done. And that is around the question of norms. And you know, I think it's important just repeating what these commitments are. Thanks so much to the ambassador and others who placed so many efforts in elevating human rights. I think the same is absolutely needed on the humanitarian level. And I think what that requires is we need unified political leadership. You know, it's a very, I guess, hackneyed saying to say that humanitarian problems, they don't have humanitarian solutions. They really require political solutions. And what does that take? It really was mentioned by both Advocate Jelani and the ambassador, which is that we need functioning democracies. We need respect for the rights of people, the dignity of people. And it's really going to be take people holding their governments accountable and governments to be open and to listen, because I'm so pleased to hear that in your survey, you found that people see the achievements of the UN in the humanitarian space, and we need to hear those voices so that we can implement and reinforce norms that that are seeing their anniversary this year, the 75th anniversary this year. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, Cindy. There's lots I want to come back to, but let's do that when we focus more on COVID. Michael, I want to draw you in too. Cindy just spoke about the importance of norms, and that's really relevant to your work on international law, criminal justice. And again, that's an area that perhaps was less prominent in the declaration. Why do you think that it wasn't emphasized? I mean, what do you think the declaration could have said? Maybe something that we can, follow up on in the coming months.
Right. Thank you, Natalie, and also the organizers for putting together this forum and our panel. Specific to your question, why it wasn't so pronounced, I feel that maybe because of the ICC, International Criminal Court, the leading accountability institution worldwide, it's outside the UN system. Its work is often sort of independent on its own, and there is not sufficient rapport between its work and other important works in human rights and humanitarian actions within the UN system or in a wider global governance picture. That has been said, I think that has been, that will be like that case for a while, because the founding fathers or founding mothers of the ICC has made specifically that choice to leave the institution outside the UN, given they have seen or predicted possibilities if within the UN, the big powers, those as have been cornered or cited many times in our forum today, those big superpowers think they can get away with their veto power whatsoever. Those big countries or their allies, they would not join the court or join the court like the International Court of Justice, join the court but not accepting its jurisdiction. So you see that even ICCs outside United Nations, I think they have more member states than those accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. So that is a choice made long time ago. It won't be changed like that, like for the near future. But I do think that to follow up on the declarations we have, we do need to specifically visit some of the cases, some of the very pronounced cases, like Cindy was just mentioning about the Rohingya Myanmar situation. Of course, lots of institutions are engaged, but how the accountability, how the international justice response contributed or helped the resolve of the situation. People need to see proof, people need to see evidence before they believe in those things. I think lots of the times we feel that we're doing the work, great work, and that's the end of it. We should also leave the publicize of it outside the work of those institutions. I feel like we need to see more analyzed, we need to see more quoting citations of this work when we're talking about human rights and humanitarian works in the governance terminologies.
Thanks so much, Michael. And I want to come back to some of the issues that maybe we haven't been focusing on so much in the last few months because of COVID. But we have to focus on COVID. So I do want to move on to that now. And Advocate Jelani, you actually answered the questions I wanted to put to you on many of the issues that we're seeing, as a result of this crisis. So I want to maybe put it to you in a more provocative way. How do we really convince leaders, but also parts of the population, to care about human rights issues, especially civil and political rights, about civil society space, at a time when people are worried about their jobs, about their, the future of their country, about security? I mean, I think, it was interesting that we had so many issues in our global consultation that were related to human rights, but I'm not sure people would necessarily see them as human rights issues. It was access to technology, it was education, it was water and sanitation, it was unemployment. So how do we reconcile the tension, both at the public level, but also with governments?
Natalie, you were very right when in the beginning you said this is a time for reflection. I think it is a time that we can use this reflection to bring about a consciousness amongst states of the fact that human rights were not made for good times. Human rights standards are very much there to guide us over the bad times and to make sure that while we are making our policies and doing whatever we can to mitigate the effects of, for instance, this pandemic or any other crisis, whether it's conflict or civil crisis, we need to understand that human rights are ever present, and that we can never expect that crises, whether it is of a political nature, economic nature, or a social conflict that we are confronting at any time, gives us the reason to ignore human rights. The resolution of all our problem lies within the respect for human rights, the rule of law, and for respect for democratic dispensation. So I think this is absolutely important that we understand that. It is true that governments are, in a crisis. They have very difficult challenges to overcome, but not only that they shouldn't feel kind of stressed out or get into a panic about it, and in that situation and in that condition, relinquish their responsibilities and obligations to respect human rights. It's also that governments actually intentionally, deliberately, sometimes have used these crises to target, for instance, minorities, to discriminate, to make sure that, some of those nationalist ideals are put forward in a way that divide populations, to sometimes target the whole question of celebration of diversity, to understand and adjust your policies in order to accommodate the different nature of their population and their different needs at different times. So I think it's very important that the United Nations, for instance, makes sure that, like Ambassador said, the United Nations, it doesn't serve governments. It is we, the people, who the United Nations is supposed to serve. So the basic role of the United Nations is to scrutinize the conduct of governments, especially when there are periods of stress, that those periods do not result in taking away the people's rights or their ability to enjoy freedoms, human rights, and at the same time, be engaged, be consulted. One of the problems with this COVID thing that I saw, especially in my country, was that decision-making really shrunk into a few hands. Parliament was marginalized. Everybody thought because this is an emergency, nobody wants to consult the Parliament and waste time. These are some things that have a long-term effect in denigrating democracy, denigrating the obligation towards respecting the rule of law. And I think these are some of the things that we should highlight also in the performance and role that the United Nations has to fulfill. Now, for instance, I think the special procedures and thematic and country rapporteurs of the human rights system in the UN perform very well. I think they are the ones who are bringing out information where it would have been difficult for that information to surface enough for anything to be done about some of the very serious aberrations that we see, or even to bring out the more positive effects of governmental action on human rights. I also think that the individual complaints mechanisms play a good role, a positive role in giving relief and redress and bringing out information, especially with regard to those who are very vulnerable and their voices are really not heard. I'm a little disappointed, really, by the Universal Periodic Review process. I think this has become more of a reporting rather than an accountability mechanism. And that, as a veteran, in human rights and somebody who's been looking forward to more and more strengthening of accountability processes, not just at the multilateral level and the UN, but also within our own countries, where there is an integrity, a credibility attached to accountability, I am really disappointed. I also think that the membership of the Human Rights Council. The conditions required for that must be strengthened, that governments, not only with regard to their obligation, for instance, to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and to fully cooperate with the Council, but their past record on human rights also must be scrutinized. And I suppose it's not difficult for the High Commissioner to arrange for an annual report as a basis for such scrutiny, so that governments who have this aspiration know very well where they fall in qualification for such membership. So I do think that there are many things that all of us at our different levels need to do, where the UN, governments, civil society, and national institutions and national, like judiciary, etc., they all have to play a role, and that role will have to be directed towards one particular objective, and that is to give people a wholesome environment in which they can practice their rights, they can feel no fear of the state, but rather respect the state. And unfortunately, states are now gaining more and more power to control and becoming weaker and weaker in their obligations to protect the people.
Thank you, Advocate Jalani. I was certainly taking notes, some very good concrete recommendations there. Perhaps the Ambassador was too. I'm going to come to you, Ambassador, later in this round as the unfortunate person to respond on behalf of all member states and how you're going to reconcile what you've heard. But I wanted to just quickly bring in Cindy and Michael, perhaps just some quick reflections, Cindy, on what do you think are the most critical issues now facing, refugees and IDPs, displaced populations in particular, as some of the most, vulnerable among us. This crisis has shown us that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable. So what is really keeping you up at night?
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, for asking this question. And, I do want to highlight that Refugees International has produced many reports, on the long list of recommendations that we would like to see implemented, and then just highlight a couple of the most urgent. And as you rightly said, really the health of one is the health of all. So I really appreciate what Advocate Jalani said about, human rights they're not made for the best of times. We need them in challenging times. And the same is true of inclusion, of that agenda of how can we have inclusive and equitable access, to immediate health services, and then when a vaccine is available, to deliver on the promise of a people's vaccine so that they do reach the most vulnerable, including refugees and other forcibly displaced populations. So around that, we certainly need more funding, coordination, and leadership. Another really critical area is around supporting food and humanitarian supply chains. And we know that the number of people expected to become acutely food insecure is supposed to double by the end of the year. So what are some measures that we would recommend? That includes humanitarian corridors, consideration of special visas for essential humanitarian staff, and different fast-track procedures for aid delivery. Here, I really want to underscore the opportunity around localization. I do believe that crisis is sometimes an opportunity, and we know so many people delivering on the front lines because of various COVID restrictions and lack of access are local civil society. So how do we use this as an opportunity to really shift the power dynamic, not only the funding dynamic, about really supporting those communities on the front lines of delivering humanitarian assistance? I'll just flag 2 or 3 other things. Another is around which is also an area where I think there's a longer term win-win and opportunity, and that's including the forcibly displaced in national responses and national systems. A great deal of the work that I've done is around the entry of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks in the refugee service space, and they need to be intimately tied together. And so are there opportunities when we think about economic recovery to include refugees in labor market access and other self-reliance, which we know activities, which we know can deliver economic and social cohesion benefits. I want to also highlight the need to focus on gender disparities. Women all over the world are facing the double pandemic of COVID and the rise in sexual and gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. That is even more true for refugees, where they lack safe spaces, and even more pronounced decreases in sexual and reproductive health services. There's also the challenge, also that very few refugee children go to school at all. And we know in previous pandemics, girls return to school at lower rates. And so you can just imagine that that challenge will be even greater for refugees. So we really need to double down and focus on the support that's needed there. And that is tied to how we can work with the World Bank and others in terms of including the forcibly displaced in systems. And then the last point that I would mention really builds on the earlier statements around COVID as a pretext to reduce access to rights, and that has very much been the case around access to asylum. So countries that under the cover of public health have reduced or eliminated the right to seek asylum. And that's something that we at Refugees International care very much about. There are ways to allow people to seek asylum where they are, where health services and testing are made available to them, and that we feel is an area of great urgency. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm actually going to ask the ambassador to come in now, and Michael, I'll save you for the next round, because I think it would be really important to hear from an EU perspective, and also to some extent, broader government perspective. Building on, everything you've heard, what are you thinking international organizations can really do to respond in the immediate term, but also in the longer term, to strengthen human rights and humanitarian systems?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Natalie, again, and thank you for colleagues. The interventions, I think, are very, very good. I think the problem is that, that those of us who've been speaking so far seem to be very, we think exactly the same. We work on the same agenda. We're pushing this. And strangely enough, as logical and common sense this may sound, there is resistance. And sometimes I think it's remarkable, given how the world evolves, that there's still some very strong forces who are questioning that we should work together, questioning the UN's reason for being, etc., instead of sort of hooking up with us and trying to make sure that the UN improves and becomes more effective, but always based on this notion that we are tied, we are in this boat together, and this slogan, I think, coming out of the COVID-19, that no one is safe until everyone is safe everywhere, is just so powerful if you think about it. And that, should reflect everything we do. When we, instead of hoarding to get the vaccines, we should work together to ensure that everyone gets the vaccine, because we will not be safe until everyone is safe. That's just one of those reflexes need to be reminded. But coming back to something I think Ms. Delani said on the human rights agenda, that strangely enough, the UN is still, in spite of the fact that some powerful countries and forces who are working against this human rights agenda, the UN is still considered with a lot of legitimacy when it speaks up, right? A lot of people around the world are looking to the UN to be the fact, the non-politicized, the factual, authority on, where are we? What's the problem here? And also actually to resolve some of those issues, especially on the humanitarian side. I would say a little bit less on the human rights side, because there's still a lot of sensitivities about the UN being too intrusive, especially governments that are concerned, that violate human rights, are very concerned about the UN coming in and lecturing and opening up societies, etc. So there is an endemic problem there. But just to say that, the legitimacy of the UN in itself is super important. And I think the Secretary General over this COVID period has done really well in spite of the difficulties with New York lockdown and whatnot, to put forward constantly, the figures, the social economic cost of this, the human rights cost, the fact that domestic violence and gender-based violence is on the increase, that civil space is shrinking, etc. And we need that kind of very factual statements coming out there with the authority and legitimacy that only the UN has. But on the humanitarian side, and I think Cindy mentioned this, I was also in a meeting with the leader of the World Food Program the other day, and he speaks to this, that there might be 270 million people under severe hunger at the end of this year, which is a huge increase. It's a doubling of last year. And I think it's just a tremendous failure of our society that in this day and age, people should go hungry anywhere. And much of this is man-made. It's because of conflicts. So that also speaks to the fact that the UN needs we need to help the UN to be better at resolving, preventing conflict, using political means, mediation to resolve conflicts as they erupt. The humanitarian response, I think, has been generally improved over the years. There's still gaps, that the financial support is not fulfilling the pledges or the appeals that are being made. So there is a financial shortage constantly. That is a huge problem. But I think the system has been better in working together. And again, I think the Secretary General has done a good job under pressure from many of us to have the system come together better. There are many humanitarian actors, but it's no good if they, do not cooperate with each other. You can respond quickly to a humanitarian crisis somewhere, but unless you do it in a way which, protects those who are most vulnerable, could be girls or women, you need the expertise of UN Women here. So the system really needs to work together, and also whatever you do on the humanitarian side needs to be looked at what it means for development. How can we connect those efforts to make sure that it isn't just a band-aid, that it actually creates more resilience moving forward, that you protect societies. And by the way, the human rights agenda has to be part of that too. Cindy spoke about localization, and I think that's also been improved. There's more understanding of the fact that the local players are most and best equipped usually to know the local circumstances, etc. So I think there's a lot going on which is positive. It's just that the task is increasing, and the COVID is doing a lot to increase that. And we see again countries that are already humanitarian hotbeds and in conflict are of course again suffering most right now, also of the conflict, of the COVID situation. I want to say that as I said, the prevention, the political solution to these conflicts, the Security Council is not really, I've been on the council. I represented Sweden when Sweden was on the Security Council, and I was very often super frustrated about the fact that we were quite good at all this peacekeeping, that's good, but that's already when the conflicts have already erupted, cost a lot of money, put these peacekeepers in, but that's after, we should have done much more before. So what we should be doing much more of is to avoid these, and Michael was mentioning these permanent members, use of the veto, etc. Just do away with that kind of protecting your national narrow political interest, and just come together at least to support the various mediators that the UN and the Secretary General has put on the ground. If they get the backing of the entire Security Council, China, Russia, US, France, the rest of us, it's quite a formidable mandate. But the day, and it happens far too often, the Security Council becomes dithering, and there's the media doesn't know whether he has the support of this or that player. His or her mandate on the ground to get parties together before conflict erupts becomes much more difficult. Final point on this is the international humanitarian law, and Michael also spoke about the international law part of this. The fact, the impunity, the level of violations in some of these conflicts of humanitarian law, going after schools, ambulances, aid workers with complete impunity, is just horrendous, and it's increased over the years. The civilian casualties of these conflicts are massive because of the violations of international humanitarian law. So we need to really reinforce, accountability. ICC was mentioned, and there's much to be said there. And we cannot just, I remember the days not that many years ago when we were really infuriated when civilians were killed in conflict, and it's as if we have now, grown accustomed to the fact that this is a natural part of the cost of war. It shouldn't be. So there's a huge agenda out there. And again, I can just say that, I can commit the European Union to stand up against and fight for all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. And I don't think I'm overstepping the mark as a UN official to say that your tenure on the council really made a powerful case for the value of the elected members. I'm also apologizing for my visibility on screen. It must be sort of implicit technological racial bias here, but at a certain time of day, I just can't get the lighting to work here. So I'm sorry about that. I have to ask a final question. It's going to be a quick fire round, if I may ask you for sort of 30-second answers, except for Michael. You might get a minute because I missed you out before. And I want to pick up on something the ambassador said about the fact that we all, probably on this call, in this forum, agree that global cooperation is necessary, human rights are necessary, etc. That is not by no means a universal view. Then that's something that has been quite a powerful dividing line in the last few months. But I think perhaps, Ambassador, you and others can take heart that in the UN 75 global consultation, two things came out very strongly. One was in all regions, I think even in all countries, across all age groups and across all social groups, education level, income level, people overwhelmingly said global cooperation is vital and more important in light of COVID. They said the UN was essential, and support to the hardest hit in their own countries and other countries was a top priority across the board. So, you have that. On the other hand, even the most UN-friendly groups, Stimson centers of this world, wanted more effective and inclusive multilateralism. So I want to put two questions to you for this quick fire round. Pick which one you want, perhaps a comment on both. What do you think we can really do to make global governance more effective and inclusive? What is the most transformative step we can take in this regard, but also the most feasible, bearing in mind the difficult political context and the fact that not everyone may think as we do. So effectiveness or inclusion, what's the one thing we can do? Michael, I'm going to start with you.
Well, obviously, that's a very, very difficult question to answer, especially from me, someone working on the grassroots level, on the talking to people day and day, and less on the policy level. On the top of my mind, I would say that it's not mutually exclusive for sure. You need to have more inclusive and also more effectiveness. I just see that we're suffering from lack of this too, day by day. But I do feel like the most important thing is to make sure that the voice being heard at this moment. I feel like this world is getting more and more marginalized, where political leaders feel that now the world is upside down, and let's get to a very few group of people and then make the decisions, make the shots, and then leave the people, be the refugees or be the victims of the violence, and leave them out. I feel that's not very effective and definitely not inclusive. I hope that is my 30 seconds or 1 minute.
You did very well, Michael. Cindy?
Yeah, I would say two things. I think One, given the array of challenges, I think we have to fight against the urge to be fully comprehensive and take on every issue. I think one way to build back the credibility and the strength of multilateralism is to collaborate on a few targeted issues and show the member states and the people that this does work. And I think, again, COVID is an opportunity. And then the second piece that I'll mention, of course, I think refugees should be on that short list of issues. Everyone will have their own. And I do think I want to harken back to what I said about bringing, making real that humanitarian development nexus. Again, we know that enabling refugee self-reliance can be a win-win, but there's this hard collaboration and work to be inclusive, to bear the fruits of that participation and inclusion. Thank you.
Advocate Jelani, what's your one big recommendation for us? Sorry, you're still on mute, Advocate Jelani. Could you unmute yourself, please?
I was saying you just threw this question at us, which is extremely important, but needs a lot of reflection. So there's no just small, short answer to this that I can give, except to say that inclusiveness makes for effectiveness. And that is the essence of a multilateral system. I think a multilateral system is indispensable for global peace, for making the right decisions that are right for a majority of the population in the world, especially those who are less visible, who are more vulnerable. So I think this collective wisdom that comes out of multilateralism is one of the most important things, and we have to stick to it. We have evidence of the importance of multilateralism because since it has started waning in the past few years, and people have attacked multilateralism and taken up positions which are more nationalistic and have in many ways denigrated multilateral organizations and actions. I think since then we've seen our troubles grow.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure you'll have time to expand a little bit on the initial answer in the Q&A. There are lots of questions about recommendations as well. Ambassador, a final one or two sentence recommendation of the many things you raised. What would you most want to focus on?
Look, I think COVID is a reminder that when crises hit, we are also able to come together to, in a crisis mode. Some of the measures taken are very drastic. I think we need to just see that there are other crises out there that requires the same kind of urgency. The human rights violations, the peaceful solution of conflicts, the climate change crisis, and the broader inequality agenda are some of those priorities. And in order to do that in an effective way, you guys, civil society, youth, you need to put much more pressure on your leaders around the world to make sure that your voices are included.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that. And I think some of the questions we've had from the audience so far actually pick up on themes that you raised. So the first one, is things that I think both Advocate Jelani and Ambassador Skoog touched on. And it's from Tar Thet from Myanmar. Apologies for butchering your name if I did. And that question really is about the fact that human rights have often been associated with imperialism or, Western tendencies. Same for humanitarian support, actually. So the question is, what can be done to rebuild trust around human rights in countries such as Myanmar? How can it become something that is more acceptable? And I'll add on a second question to that from Haley McKenzie in Canada, which is to Cindy, but I think Michael, you touched on it as well. What can be done to mitigate the increasingly global trend of hyper-nationalism? Which has resulted in countries closing their borders to refugees, having slower and less intensive reactions to human rights violations, humanitarian situation, which Ambassador, touched upon in the context of the pandemic. So perhaps Advocate Jelani and Ambassador, you can look at that question of human rights, and then Cindy and Michael, the question on nationalism. But feel free to comment if you want on the other question, of course. Advocate Jelani, let's start with you.
You know, I think it's a very important question that has come before us, because we cannot promote the cause of human rights unless and until those who really need for their human rights to be well respected have a respect for those rights themselves and have a firm faith and belief that the realization of rights can improve their lot, that they can improve their lives through human rights. I come from a country where human rights violations have reached a really critical stage now, whether it's the freedom of association and the ability of the civil society to survive, the freedom of human rights defenders, their safety, the freedom of journalists. But I tell you that when these kind of crises erupt, where violations have become everyday norms and where the ability to find relief becomes very difficult because institutions have been eroded, then you realize, and those whose violations are occurring, whose rights are being violated, realize more strongly than any of us how important human rights are. And that's when I have had people turn to me and say, now we realize why you have spent so much time trying to advocate for governments to respect our rights. And I think this is something that comes with experience. This comes also when you have gone through certain experiences where the rights have been violated. But my warning to those who are skeptical because it hasn't happened to you yet is it will happen. When it's happening in such a widespread way, the violations will come home to you as well. So the best thing is to join the forces that want to strengthen human rights, that want to strengthen mechanisms of accountability for human rights violations, those who want to make sure that institutions like the judiciary, etc., are independent and are able to give us relief. I think it's important to give up cynicism and skepticism and really believe in human rights before violations hit you.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, your comments?
Yes, thank you. It's very easy to follow on Advocate Jelani. I think she's made a very powerful point about, it's sort of this enlightened self-interest of everyone, including leaders of the world, that, eventually society will demand from you that you open up. I mean, we have some situation in Europe right now, in Belarus, for instance, that there is this tide of as soon as you give the space for political freedoms, that space will be filled by people who have been repressed and who will speak up and demand change. And an institution should be servicing the people, not instilling fear in people, as Advocate Jelani just said. So that's very important. I understand the point about colonialism and its past, and in Europe there are some painful colonial past that are terrible, promoting slavery and whatnot, and that's a shame on the European continent's history. But I don't think it's a reason for us to be less convinced about today, in this day and age, that respect for human rights is something that should be in the DNA of every leader in the world. Not just because it's something we preach, it's because we found that is the best way to create prosperity and growth and equality and prosperous societies. We are also the biggest donor in the world, so it's not that we are shying away from a responsibility to help less, poorer countries to also grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Michael, I'm going to come to you again. You can take a little bit of time because I missed you out before. But it's a question of nationalism, which I think touches on the issues of criminal justice, the role of the P5, and other issues you've raised already.
Right. Well, I'm so glad someone raised this question. And as much as I'm so glad to come to the forum, precisely because the nationalism, toxic environment I'm living in and also have to deal with every day back in China, that I'm very glad that people still think this is not okay, and then we need to find a way to get out of it. Short answer to this is that we have to be resilient. We believe in it, we should fight for it. There's no other way around it. in the past months, because of the COVID, because of the government's narratives, and because of the international situation, geopolitical struggles, you can see that the nationalism is like tripled, if not doubled, in China. And then that case reminds me that how fragile the civil society or the discourse, the nationalism or liberal international order could be, seeing some of the friends or the allies have changed sides. I think that leaves each and every one of us to be resilient and stand up for it. Sometimes be vocal, sometimes be angry, some other panelists have said, and then be there and then continue the dialogue. You're not going to suppress the other way. The people is going to suppress you, but you cannot change like immediately like this. I think it's important to have that dialogue, even though you think the other side is not right, and try to make sure that there is a room for them to join your side of the story. And that is make sure that you're there. And that's the least thing we can do in these difficult times. I do want to address a little bit on the rights culture. My neighbor from Myanmar, my friend from Myanmar, the neighboring country, has addressed. I have that question myself before. I have to deal with it all the time as well. I feel that sometimes it's not about new culture, new colonialism. It's about our own culture. It does not really see things from the rights angle. It's not about people turning things to us. It's about the things that we just traditionally don't see the things from individual rights, be it human rights, or you call it civil rights or other things. And I absolutely agree with Junali that the experience, the violations will come to you. It is only, like, lots of people have that faith in rights because they have that experience, they have been taking actions, and it will come to you. So come and join on this side, repeating that, and also there is something believing by taking actions. When you see enough, when you have experienced it, when you have heard stories of others have experienced that, I do feel that's the game changer on your narrative of what happened and your belief in the rights, in the human rights.
Thanks, Michael. That resonates quite a lot with me as well, coming from both Asia and Europe, I have to say. Cindy, the question on nationalism to you, and I'm also going to, if I may be cheeky, tack on a question on inequalities and looking at the role of financial institutions as well. I know you've had some experience working with the World Bank. That came from, I think it was Rose, then the name sort of disappeared again, Rose Dyson. I think it's disappeared from my chat. But if you could address the, nationalism and economic issues, which are unrelated as well, that would be great.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for these questions. And I want to build on what Michael was saying about the bottom-up perspective in terms of combating nationalism and hyper-nationalism. So first, I would say from an analytical perspective that there is a big gap between what nationalist and authoritarian leaders say and the populations, and that's been a consistent theme of our conversation today. And some of the research that's been done on that, really shows that there's a large group of people in the middle who are, for what, economic, social, and cultural reasons, feeling a lot of anxiety. There is a lot of change in the world, technology, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of, and rising inequality. So there's a lot of upheaval. So, I think what's so important, as Michael was saying, is you got to engage those people in the middle, and you have to grow the tent of people who are willing to stand up and stand up, not just in a way of being advocates, but just to connect with others in their communities and connect across the lines that are dividing us so terribly today. Then there's another level, kind of beyond the individual, where we know that there's a lot of work done around strategic communications. How do we uplift those stories of people who are engaging with refugees? In America, the vast majority of actually support for immigrants is higher than ever, yet that's not what you're seeing from political leadership. So how do we elevate the voices and use communications techniques to really show that people are grappling, but they're on this journey? And when you And when you meet someone, there's also the human experience. So you can have those experiences of welcome, and then how do you share those in a way that can reach scale? And I do, apologies for a self-interested plug, but today at Refugees International at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're launching a new initiative precisely to engage and build that constituency for US leadership on refugee protection, called the Refugee Advocacy Lab. And it's really building on those principles of engagement and communications that I talked about. And it's so interesting because, again, in the time of COVID, it's quite difficult to meet people face to face, but people are finding ways to connect creatively. And then, of course, there's the top down in terms of leadership. We need leaders who will stand united. We need the multilateral systems to be strong to help promote inclusion and democracy. And, so I would say, we want to see that kind of robust engagement and support for civil society and for the voices of people to be heard. On that issue of inequality and the role of international financial institutions, I think there is a very strong role that can be played. I will always provide the caveat, not that the World Bank and other institutions have been perfect by any means, but that the reduction in poverty that we're seeing now is being rolled back. I think there's a really critical role to play in bringing together that rights and inclusion agenda with the very significant financing that those institutions have. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm gonna have, I think, a final round of questions. Again, I'll try and direct one at a couple of speakers and one at the other. And they really build on some of the messages that came out of the UN 75 consultation and some of the recommendations. So one I would like to put to the ambassador and to Michael, and that related to this call, and it's been echoed here, I think, by Giovanna from Brazil and some others, on how do you make the UN more inclusive? And there have been some specific proposals put forward. A high-level civil society champion at the UN, for example, a youth advisory network beyond what we have for climate right now, more engagement with cities and parliamentarians. So that's one bucket of questions. And then the second one, which I'd like to put to Cindy, and I'll give Advocate Jelani the final word, is this question of implementation. And it came up, I think, in Advocate Jelani's comments about the universal periodic review, but it applies across the board. And it's come up here again. I think Jung-hee from South Korea has posted, Jeff from the US. How do you really encourage states to respect the commitments that they've made under international treaties and agreements? That's something that we've seen. We've seen a lot of reneging in the past few months, and how do we stem that flow? So let me start with the ambassador and this question on creative ideas to make the UN more inclusive.
Yes, thanks a lot. It's super important that question, and I think I put it in all the other interventions I made. The problem we face again is that there is an NGO committee, for instance, made up of some member states, and of course those who volunteer to sit on that committee some of them are there just to ensure that some of these NGOs are not allowed in. And that's the drawback with an organization that is, as I said, initially is made up of governments, and some of them are very critical to allowing civil society voices come in. So I think we just need to work very diligently and try to find more allies in the UN family of member states to protect that space, to increase that space. I'm not sure that the solution is to have a special envoy on civil society participation. I think it's more about all of us who believe in this to work very hard to increase that space. And I think over the last few years there is a greater openness to invite some parts of civil society, especially private finance. That's not necessarily representative, but it's an important opening at least. So, banks and people with money are more invited, etc. And maybe that is, and we always make sure that when they are there should also be civil society representatives from other stakeholders present. So I think there is a process ongoing. We just need to fight really, really hard to protect it, and also to make sure what youth tell me quite often when I speak to them is that couldn't just be a token inclusion. It has to be one which is meaningful and which is listened to. But there is also some, and Natalie, unfortunately, some very urgent issues that we need to do, and the EU is doing a lot, and it's about protecting human rights defenders who speak up, who speak to the UN, who may even be invited to come to the UN, but are then harassed, coming back, and they're putting their lives at risk for putting facts forward and presenting their points of view in the UN. That's completely unacceptable and completely contrary to what I spoke to before about the UN Charter being open to the peoples. So, the EU has some projects going to protect and defend these people. But that again is more like a humanitarian, like a crisis effort, when really the space should just be there, and there should be monitoring to make sure that whoever speaks up here are free to do so. There should be freedom of speech also in the UN. So we're working on it, but we also need your help to have creative ideas. Final point, the UN at 75 declaration, it's not adopted yet, but it will be, we hope, as it stands. It actually opens up for a broad consultation process, building on what you've been doing, Natalie, and your colleagues, the surveys and polls you've done, but to really have, when we reflect on the UN we want for the next 75 years, that those voices need to be picked up and heard. And there are hooks and space created in this declaration. So we just need to help you mobilize, and we're ready to do that. Thank you. I have to leave, unfortunately. I tried to respond a little bit on the chat, but I'm not sure whether I was, technically capable to do that.
You were. I've seen your answers, and thank you so much for being generous with your time and answers today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Michael, I'm going to pass the baton on to you to pick up from some of the ambassadors' comments. How can we make the UN more inclusive and meaningfully so? Right.
I absolutely agree with some of the ambassador's points. Since he's leaving, so I feel it's even it's even safer to disagree with him on the idea of having a special envoy or ASG or USG on the addressing the or being the focal point within the UN or the coordination force within the UN on the civil society side. Well, there are bigger organizations like Cindy's organizations or these organizations have been meaningfully engaged with the UN, but also from my work and also in the place I work, lots of the civil societies, human rights defenders, they feel the UN is still very, very, very far away and it cannot play meaningful role in their work, which is just a natural, I think. But also having that special envoy send a very strong message in this difficult time. Even symbolic it is, a message to these people that UN is changing and UN wants to hear and UN can be reached by you guys. And here is what we're doing by this. And then you can try, maybe not work in their favor, maybe still their UN will be still very remote from their daily works, but still I think that's a very good way ahead. With that, I shall concur to my learned ambassador friends.
Thank you, Michael. And Cindy, that question on implementation, how can we get states to commit to what they've committed to and actually do it?
Yeah, and I think it's so important. I'm going to focus on something that may seem small, but I think can be transformative in the longer term, which is to move from a concept of consultation to really having these critical actors, whether it be civil society or the private sector, as the ambassador mentioned, at the decision-making table. Now, that's not going to be on the Security Council, but there's so many ways where it is possible. And I'll just provide one example that also helps to answer the earlier question on inclusion and UN World Bank thinking on longer term solutions to protracted displacement. And that is many of the programs that are starting up that are joint around including refugees in national systems. You know, there are you could set up a council whereby, you know, civil society has a voice at the table in how the programs are used, funds are used, and it doesn't have to be the majority vote, it will never be, but I think really putting some of that decision making in so that people feel they are very much bought in to these processes and programs would be a critical step forward.
Thanks so much. And Advocate Janani, I'll give you the final word to comment on that and any final reflections you'd like to make.
You know, very briefly, we have done a lot and come a long way in opening the space for inclusion of the civil society at the UN. I'll tell you why these international fora are important for us. I'm a human rights defender myself, and most of our work is, of course, engaging in our own countries and fighting out our battles there. But there comes a time when the freedoms are so restricted and the state is either unwilling or unable to give protection to people's rights, and defenders face a difficult task. And that's the time when we need international support. And we need voices from outside to expose the situation that we are confronting in our own countries. At that point, access to the UN becomes almost critical, not just to hear our voices, but to save our lives. So I do believe that that kind of access now has to reopen, and the UN has to consider this very seriously. The problem with the UN, of course, is, and we all know that this is a system which is made up of governments, and we are expected to discuss their shortcomings with them and expect them to overcome that. So these are some of the problems that, of course, will always be there. But if the UN is strong enough in terms of a mixture of stakeholders being present there, there is always a chance that the opening will come. And without this opening, I think the role of the UN will remain much more limited and restricted, and perhaps of less use to the people on the ground.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, we were looking at the world in 1945 and compared to now the other day, and people think of lots of challenges, climate change, technologies, but one of the biggest changes really is all the actors who are now, you know, jostling for influence in these various spheres, and the UN will have to need to accommodate them in a better way, even more accountable way to adapt and survive. But thank you so much to you, Advocate Jalani, you know, for those final comments, also to Cindy and Michael, and of course the ambassador in his absence. You've given us so much food for thought. I think hopefully also food for action, some clear recommendations. Thank you also everyone, you know, watching for the great questions and to the, you know, to the organizers. I'm very glad I don't have to do the summary, and I'm not going to be having to write the report. So that'll be the Stimson Center and colleagues, and I very much look forward to reading that report. And I can also say, you know, it will form a concrete, substantive, you know, kind of higher level input into the UN 75 consultation process, dialogue process. We will continue our dialogues till the end of the year. We will keep our survey open till the end of the year. The report that comes out next week is really to coincide with the official ceremony to mark the 75th anniversary, but we really want to switch now, you know, from looking at what people want to how do we make this a reality and much more solutions focused conversation. So thank you for making a huge contribution to that today. Don't forget to stay tuned to the next session. I know there's a host of interesting discussions coming up today and tomorrow. And thank you all so much again. I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Natalie.
you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.